I remember the beginning like it was just yesterday, though it was decades ago now. The moment humanity reached out to the stars, we had hopes and dreams that, for once, didn't involve the constant struggle for survival. For millennia, Earth had been our cradle, a small blue planet teeming with life. But humanity had always felt there was more beyond the limits of our atmosphere, more than the bounds of our endless wars, resource shortages, and political struggles. We looked to the heavens, and the heavens seemed to promise something bigger, something grander. When the first explorers left Earth's orbit, they did so with wonder in their eyes, the shared belief that there was a future to be built among the stars. Early expeditions to nearby planets marked the first steps into a new era, and with each discovery we grew more certain that we were not alone. The first contact came when we discovered the krill, a species of floating, bioluminescent life forms whose technology was beyond anything we had imagined. Their methods of communication were complex and elegant, based on electromagnetic waves and pulses of light, and they took great care in explaining their ways to us in ways that we could understand. That was the beginning of the Federation, a coalition of species, each distinct in its own right, yet united by the idea that the universe could be more than just endless conflict. There was hope for the first time that peace was possible. At first, the Federation was not a government, but a loose agreement between worlds to share knowledge and resources, to explore the stars together. Humanity was included as a fledgling member, just another species trying to find its place in the galaxy. We were young and eager, like a child being invited to sit at the grown-ups' table, and for a while it worked. For decades, we learned from the other species how to harness advanced technologies, how to communicate across light years with ease, how to build and sustain colonies on distant planets. We helped where we could, offering our own ingenuity and creativity, even as we were outclassed in many ways. Humanity brought something different to the table, an unrelenting drive to push beyond known limits, to always strive for more. We may not have been the most powerful species in the Federation, but we brought a unique energy to the Alliance. But as time went on, that energy began to feel like something different, a liability rather than an asset. Slowly, we realized that not all species viewed us as equals. The krill, for all their wisdom, were distant and detached, more concerned with their own preservation than with the future of the Federation. The Joran, a race of insectoid beings, saw our species as weak, their disdain for our primitive biology obvious every time we interacted with them. And the Vortak, oh, the Vortak. They were the worst, always lurking in the shadows of the Federation, always watching, waiting, taking note of every mistake humanity made. They had their eyes on the galaxy, and they did not see humanity as a partner. They saw us as a resource. And so we endured. We patiently bore the weight of the Federation's expectations, the demands of species that didn't truly understand us, and the exploitation of our world's resources by those who could take without giving. We hoped that one day things would change, that the galaxy would see us for what we could be, not just what we were. But in the back of our minds, we always knew that the system was stacked against us. The moment the cracks began to show, though, we still believed that there was time. Time to prove ourselves, time to show them. But we could not foresee that time running out so swiftly. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. But as the years wore on, the signs became harder to ignore. The Vortak were a species known for their cunning, their ability to manipulate situations to their advantage without ever seeming to break a sweat. They were masters of politics, of influence, and they had their claws deep in the fabric of the Federation. The krill and Zoran may have kept their distance from humanity, but the Vortak did not. They saw an opportunity in our eagerness to please, in our desire to be accepted, and they capitalized on it. It started with small, seemingly innocuous trade deals. Resources exchanged at favorable rates, tech transfers that benefited our colonies but left us dependent on Vortak supply chains. At first, it seemed like a good thing, an exchange between equals. The Vortak were skilled traders, after all, and their technology was advanced. But something about these deals didn't sit right with us. There were always strings attached, hidden clauses, and terms that seemed to favor them more than us. But we didn't challenge them. Not at first. We had been taught that patience was a virtue, that diplomacy required us to look past the small annoyances, to endure. As months turned into years, the Vortak began to exert more pressure. They were subtle, their influence hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and diplomacy. There was no overt hostility, no outright betrayal at first. But the cracks in the system were there, and we were the ones who were paying the price. They took advantage of our naivety, using our own goodwill against us. Trade routes that we had relied on for generations were suddenly rerouted, resources diverted to their territories without explanation. And when we asked questions, when we demanded answers, their response was always the same: patience. Patience. It was always patience. Every time we raised an issue, every time we pointed out the imbalance, the unfairness, they responded with the same condescending tone. In time, you will understand, they would say, patience is the key to the greater good. As if we were children. As if we were the naive ones. As if we were too small to see the grand picture they painted for us. But it wasn't just the trade deals. No, it went deeper than that. The Vortak had infiltrated the highest levels of the Federation Council, slowly shifting the balance of power. Humanity's voice, once loud and clear, was now drowned out by the whispers of the Vortak and their allies. The Council, once a body of equals, became a tool in their hands. Every proposal we made was rejected. Every motion we introduced was shot down. Our proposals for more equitable resource distribution, for better protections for human colonies, for more transparent trade practices, each one was met with resistance, with excuses, with delays. The worst part, the other species, those who had once stood by us, began to look away. The Krill remained aloof. The Azoran scoffed at our petty concerns, and even the Zelroth, a species we had once called allies, seemed to think we were overreacting. We were the problem, they said. We weren't patient enough. We weren't understanding enough. And in our hearts, we knew what they were really saying: we weren't important enough. It was a quiet sort of betrayal, one that crept up on us over time. There was no singular moment when the Vortak stabbed us in the back. It was 1,000 little wounds, each one building upon the last, until we found ourselves bleeding, helpless, and unheard. We were exhausted. And still we waited. We waited for the Federation to see what was happening. We waited for someone, anyone, to speak out for us. But every time we asked for justice, for someone to stand with us, the answer was the same: be patient. How much longer could we endure? How many times could we be told to wait? How long before the line, drawn so carefully in our minds, was crossed? The answer was clearer with every passing day. We were done waiting. The turning point came without warning, but in hindsight it was inevitable. We had been pushed too far. The tipping point had arrived when Admiral Carter, a name that would echo throughout the galaxy for centuries, stood up in the heart of a Federation negotiation, her hand slamming down on the table with a force that reverberated through the room. The weight of her silence in that moment was more powerful than any weapon in the fleet. For so long, humanity had been told to wait, to hold back, to be patient. But no more. The meeting had been called to address the latest injustice: a new Vortak trade agreement that would give them even more control over critical human colonies. It was not just an economic setback, it was a direct blow to our sovereignty, to our very identity. It was another step in a slow, deliberate stripping away of what made us human. And as the other representative species we had worked with, learned from, trusted, sat idly by, nodding in agreement with the Vortak's terms, something inside Admiral Carter snapped. Her eyes, once calm and composed, flared with something fierce, something primal. She had seen enough. Enough, she finally said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. The room fell silent, every eye turning toward her. The once respected Admiral, known for her composed demeanor and strategic brilliance, was no longer the same woman. The patience that had characterized her every move over the years had evaporated. Enough of this. Enough of your games. The Vortak leader, Shirul, raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smile that only further fueled the anger in Carter's eyes. He thought she was merely another weak human, one who could be talked down, manipulated. But he had underestimated her. Admiral Carter, Cyril Cood, I believe you misunderstand. Patience is required. We're speaking about the future of all of us. No, Carter shot back, her voice steady but full of a quiet fury. You're speaking about the future of yourselves. You've made your moves, Cyril. You've stolen from us, you've manipulated, you've played your political games, and I've watched my people suffer for it. Her hands clenched, the knuckles white as she leaned forward. But no more. No more. We're done. Humanity's patience has run out. It was a strange moment of calm, a collective breath drawn in the room as her words hung in the air. The Vortak, with all their cunning, couldn't fathom what they were witnessing. They had always counted on humanity's diplomacy, our desire to find peace, to negotiate. They had thought that our tolerance would last forever. But in that moment they saw something they had never accounted for: the raw, unyielding force of a species that had been pushed too far. The other representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They, too, had grown weary of the Vortak's influence, but they were afraid. Afraid of losing their place in the Federation. Afraid of upsetting the delicate balance that had held everything together. But for the first time, they could no longer ignore what was happening. What had been happening for years. The realization dawned on them: humanity was no longer asking for justice. We weren't pleading for a seat at the table. We were taking control of the conversation. The quiet that followed was broken by the Vortak's voice, cool and dismissive. And what exactly do you propose? Human Cyril's tone was one of mockery, as if he were speaking to a child. We propose that you step aside, Carter replied, her voice calm but filled with a dangerous certainty. We're done with the Federation's politeness. We are taking back what's ours, and if that means ending our agreements, severing ties, then so be it. The weight of her words settled over the room like a storm cloud, a collective realization dawning in the hearts of every species present. It was no longer about diplomacy. It was no longer about waiting. Humanity had reached its breaking point, and the galaxy would soon understand the cost of underestimating us. The patience had snapped, and there was no going back. In the days that followed Admiral Carter's declaration, the Federation was plunged into a state of shock. The calm, diplomatic facade that had once defined our dealings with other species was shattered. No one, not even the Vortak, had seen it coming. Humanity, in one swift and unyielding motion, had drawn a line in the sand. It wasn't a declaration of war, not yet, but it was a challenge, a message to the galaxy that we would no longer be content with the role of passive observers. We would fight for our place. We would fight for our future. The Federation Council convened in emergency session, calling upon every representative, every leader to come to the table. But it was clear from the moment the session began that things had changed. The usual pomp and decorum that characterized such meetings was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of tension. The Vortak delegation, once smug and confident, now sat uneasy, their leader Cyril's face tight with anger, the realization dawning that humanity wasn't going to be easily swayed this time. For the first time, the other species, those who had always regarded us with a mixture of condescension and indifference, took notice. The Zelroth, who had long dismissed human concerns as insignificant, shifted their posture. The Krill, silent and distant as ever, gave subtle glances among themselves. Even the Escorin, whose disdain for us had always been thinly veiled, watched with curiosity, perhaps a hint of fear in their multifaceted eyes. Admiral Carter's bold words had ignited something in humanity. What had once been a fractured species, divided by the scars of centuries of conflict, now stood united. The colonies, once isolated, were now in lockstep with Earth's new stance. The communications between human sectors were no longer filled with the polite requests for assistance or the gentle nudging for help. They were filled with orders, directives, and strategies. Fleet commanders, who had once hesitated to move without the Council's approval, now made their decisions based on their understanding of the situation. Humanity's patience was gone, replaced with a singular focus, protection, and power. The Federation didn't know what to do. No one had ever challenged the status quo so openly. The Krill, ever the pragmatists, saw an opportunity to strengthen their ties with humanity, aligning themselves with our cause out of shared interests. But even they were cautious. The Azoran, predictably, were more aloof, their indifference tinged with the suspicion that humanity's sudden boldness might be a sign of something darker, something more dangerous. But it was the Vortak who found themselves in the most precarious position. They had miscalculated. They had thought they could push us into the corner and continue extracting what they wanted without consequence. But now they were facing the full force of humanity's rage. Humanity, once a species that had been willing to negotiate, to compromise, had no intention of playing by the old rules anymore. We had learned painfully, over decades of exploitation, that waiting and asking for permission had only brought us suffering. The next move was ours, and we would make it with the full weight of our resolve behind it. The first strike came not from the Federation's fleets, but from human ships' fleets that had once been mere pawns in the vast games of interstellar politics. They had been secretly retooled, refitted, prepared for a moment like this. The attack was swift, clinical, devastating. It was not the destruction of entire planets, no. Humanity wasn't that reckless, but it was a clear message. Vortak vessels, once untouchable in their arrogance, were crippled, their resources targeted, and their ability to move through the galaxy hindered. It wasn't an act of revenge, but an act of assertion, a demonstration that humanity could no longer be treated as a second-rate player in a game that no longer served us. The Vortak, now on the back foot, sought to retaliate. But their retaliation came too late. The balance of power had already shifted. Humanity was no longer the passive participant. The Federation was no longer a collection of weak, divided species. We were united, driven by a single purpose: to take back what was ours, to ensure that no one could ever again take advantage of us without facing the consequences. And still, we were not at war, not yet. But the lines had been drawn, the stage set. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would humanity. What had been a fracture, a breaking point, had turned into something far more powerful: a revolution of the soul. A new era where patience was no longer a virtue, but a weapon wielded with lethal precision. The days that followed the initial strike were filled with a strange, almost oppressive quiet. It was as though the entire galaxy held its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion that would come from the Vortak's retaliation, waiting for the fallout of humanity's unprecedented challenge. The Federation, which had once prided itself on unity, began to fracture. The Krill, while still outwardly neutral, began sending quiet messages of support to humanity, urging caution and diplomacy, but their backing was more of a quiet acknowledgement of our strength than anything else. The Azoran, however, were different. Their silence was not one of contemplation, it was one of suspicion, of wariness. They had never truly trusted humanity, and now, seeing us act so boldly, they feared what we might become. The Federation Council convened once more, but now, the weight of the meeting was heavier than ever. The voices of the representatives no longer carried the same tone of diplomacy. There was an edge to them, a growing sense of fear. Even the Vortak, who had once manipulated every decision, every policy, now found themselves scrambling. The other species had begun to question their influence, and that was something the Vortak had never expected. For the first time in years, they weren't the ones in control. Admiral Carter, who had been the catalyst for humanity's defiance, was now the leader of a growing coalition. But it wasn't just Earth that rallied behind her. The colonies, those distant, often overlooked settlements on the fringes of known space, had found their voice. The human colonies had been some of the most affected by the Federation's failure to protect them from the Vortak's exploitation. They were the ones who had suffered the most under the weight of unfair trade deals, unfair resource allocation, and the general apathy of the galactic community. But now, they saw a chance for something more. The colonies were not just supporters, they were the heart of humanity's newfound resolve. Fleet commanders from across the human colonies, once divided by distance and politics, now stood united behind Admiral Carter. A new kind of communication network was established, one that bypassed the Federation's central system, one that ensured that humanity's voice could never be ignored again. They had seen the weakness of the Federation, the corruption that had wormed its way into the heart of the galaxy's governing body. They had seen the endless negotiations, the delays, the promises that never came to fruition. And now, they had had enough. There was still talk of diplomacy, of finding a peaceful resolution, but it was no longer a genuine conversation. The Vortak, who had spent decades manipulating the Federation to their advantage, now found themselves facing a very real threat: humanity, united, relentless, and with nothing left to lose. The Federation could no longer simply ignore us, nor could they pretend that we were just a minor inconvenience in their grand design. The Krill, in their quiet way, began to shift their support towards us, seeing that we had the power to disrupt the balance in ways they hadn't anticipated. The Azoran were more hesitant, but their mistrust was now overshadowed by the undeniable fact that humanity had forced its way into the conversation, and there was no turning back. In the midst of these turbulent days, Admiral Carter's message became clear: humanity would no longer bow to the whims of the Federation. We would no longer wait for others to decide our fate. We would no longer be the ones to patiently watch while others took what was ours. We had learned the hard way that peace was only ever possible when we held the power to defend it, and humanity was ready to wield that power. The Federation Council was in disarray, unable to cope with the newfound unity of humanity and the growing pressure from species who, once indifferent to us, now saw the inevitable change. No one could predict the outcome, whether it would lead to a peaceful restructuring or an all-out war, but one thing was certain: humanity's patience had finally snapped, and the galaxy would never forget that moment. The tension in the galaxy had reached a breaking point. The Federation, once the shining example of interstellar cooperation, was now a fractured, splintered entity, its foundation cracking under the weight of humanity's challenge. The Vortak, who had once manipulated the system to their advantage with near perfection, were now scrambling. They had never anticipated that humanity, a species they had long regarded as naive and weak, would rise up in such a way. They had assumed that our patience, our desire for peace, would always make us pliable. But humanity had learned too much, seen too much. The years of exploitation, of waiting for others to recognize our worth, had transformed us into something different. Now, the galaxy would understand that we would not be pushed around any longer. The first real shift came when the Vortak tried to reassert their dominance. They attempted to consolidate their power within the Federation, calling for an emergency session to force a resolution, to put humanity back in its place. They pushed hard for sanctions, accusing humanity of destabilizing the fragile peace that had been so carefully constructed over the years. They painted us as the villains, as the ones who had broken the fragile unity of the Federation. But the tables had turned. The rest of the galaxy, those who had once been silent, those who had once been complacent, now saw the Vortak for what they truly were: manipulative, self-serving, and willing to sacrifice the well-being of countless species to maintain their position of power. Humanity's allies, those few who had stood with us in quiet solidarity, came forward in support. The Zelroth, the Krill, even some of the Asuran leaders, those who had once dismissed our concerns as nothing more than childish complaints, now found themselves forced to choose sides. The Vortak had played their hand too many times, and now the galaxy was looking for a new order, one in which they would no longer be the ones pulling the strings. It was no longer just a matter of political leverage, it was a matter of survival. If the Federation allowed the Vortak to retain their influence, it would spell the end for any hope of true unity. Species would be subjugated, systems would be exploited, and humanity would remain nothing more than pawns in a game we never wanted to play. Admiral Carter knew that the battle was far from over. While the Vortak were losing their grip on power, they were still dangerous, still powerful. The Federation might have fractured, but the Vortak had ally species with their own agendas, with their own interests. If humanity wanted to survive this, we couldn't afford to wait for others to act. We had to move, and we had to move quickly. It was then that Carter made the decision that would change everything. She sent a message across the galaxy, a declaration of intent to every world, every species that had witnessed humanity's rise. It was a challenge, a call to those who wanted to see the Federation reformed, to those who believed in a new order, one where no species would be subjugated, where no one would be allowed to dominate the others. Humanity is no longer content to be a bystander, the message declared. We are ready to fight for a future where we all stand equal. The time for patience is past. The time for action is now. The response was swift. The colonies, ever the backbone of humanity's resolve, rallied behind Carter. Fleet commanders took positions, not in preparation for war, but in preparation for a new kind of diplomacy, one where force would back up the words. The Vortak, already scrambling to maintain their control, now faced a united front not just of human forces, but of alien species that had grown tired of their manipulation. The Vortak's attempts to rally their allies began to falter. The Krill, who had once been silent observers, now openly aligned themselves with humanity. The Esoran, though still cautious, began to question the Vortak's true motives. And the Zelroth, always pragmatic, saw the shifting tides and chose to protect their own future, supporting the call for a new federation, one where power would be more equally distributed. It wasn't war yet, but it was something far more dangerous, a galaxy on the brink of transformation. Humanity had shown that we would not back down, that we would fight not just for ourselves, but for the future of the Federation. And for the first time, the galaxy was listening. The Vortak, despite their centuries of manipulation, were beginning to realize that they had underestimated humanity's resolve. The old order was crumbling, and a new one was on the horizon. One where no species would ever again underestimate the strength, the determination, or the power of humanity. The final act came not with a great battle, but with a quiet, profound realization. The galaxy had watched humanity for centuries, both from a distance and up close, and we had been underestimated time and time again. The Vortak had spent decades weaving their webs of influence, tightening their hold on the Federation's decision-making, convinced that we were a species destined to remain on the sidelines. But in the weeks after Admiral Carter's bold declaration, something within the very core of the Federation shifted. It wasn't the force of a single attack or the roar of battle, but the realization that humanity had taken control of its destiny, that we had learned from our past mistakes, and that we had no intention of playing by the old rules anymore. The Vortak, once the undisputed power brokers of the Federation, found their allies dwindling, their influence eroding. The Krill, who had always been cautious, now stood openly in support of humanity's reform efforts. Their fleets, once reserved for their own interests, were now positioned alongside ours, a united front against the Vortak schemes. The Exorin, calculating as ever, began to hedge their bets. Their support was still conditional, but they no longer felt the same indifference toward humanity. The Zelroth, who had once maintained their neutral stance, saw the writing on the wall and began to align themselves with the growing coalition of species who were now backing the idea of a new, more equitable federation. For the first time, the idea of a truly united galaxy, one in which no species could dominate the others, seemed possible. The Vortak, to their credit, fought back. They weren't without their resources, their cunning, or their own alliances. They tried to destabilize the Federation from within, using every tool at their disposal to fracture the newly formed coalition. But the more they tried to manipulate, the more they exposed themselves. Their ability to control the narrative, to silence dissent, had faltered. In every corner of the Federation, from the core worlds to the outermost colonies, the cracks in their power were growing wider. The Vortak had once controlled the flow of information, the balance of power, but now their words no longer carried the weight they once had. It wasn't a quick or easy victory. Humanity didn't win this war with lasers or bombs, but with something far more powerful: resolve, unity, and the willingness to never back down. We had spent years waiting for others to recognize our worth, But now we had taken the reins ourselves. We understood that true power wasn't just in military strength or economic influence, but in the ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. We had learned that there was strength in patience. Yes, but that true strength also came from knowing when to act, when to push back, and when to rise above the forces that sought to control us. The tipping point came not from a single battle or decisive strike, but from the growing sense of solidarity among the species who had once been divided. The Federation's Assembly Hall, once a place of quiet compromise and endless bureaucracy, became the stage for a historic vote. The Vortak tried one final maneuver to maintain their control, to force through a motion that would leave humanity in a subservient position, but it was no use. The voices of the Krill, the Zelroth, the Exorin all echoed in support of a new federation, one where power would be shared, where no species would dominate another. And when the final vote was cast, it was clear. The era of the Vortak's unchecked influence was over. Admiral Carter, standing before the assembly, knew that the galaxy had changed forever. It wasn't the end of the struggle, not yet. There would always be those who sought to manipulate, to control. But humanity had made its mark, had shown that we were no longer willing to play the role of the oppressed, the silenced. The moment that the Vortak's reign was officially ended, humanity stood not just as a member of the Federation, but as its equal. And though the road ahead would not be easy, we were no longer looking for permission. We were making our own future, one that no one could take from us. The galaxy would never forget the moment when humanity's patience snapped. And neither would humanity ever forget that we had risen, not with violence, but with purpose. We had fought not just for our own place in the galaxy, but for a future where no species would be forgotten, where none would be treated as inferior. It was a new era, a new dawn, and humanity was no longer a spectator in the galaxy's grand drama. We were the authors of our own story. And the universe would soon understand when humanity's patience snapped, no species would ever forget it.